Hands down, the most useful jig in my workshop is the crosscut sled for the table saw. I use it easily 10 times more than any other jig in the entire workshop. If you don't have one of these, this is about to blow your mind. I just got a new table saw, so it's time for me to make a new crosscut sled, and I'm going to show you how to build one. An alternative to using a crosscut sled is to use a miter saw or a miter gauge on your table saw. Miter gauges can be expensive for nice ones, and this is much more accurate than a miter saw if you're just making 90-degree cuts. One of the advantages of using a crosscut sled is that it has runners which go on both sides of the blade, which makes it much more stable and precise. Also, it's easy to make repeated cuts on a sled by using a stop block clamped along one of the walls. Another advantage is that the workpiece sits flush against the back wall of the sled, which prevents blowout when cutting through a piece. Also, good luck cross-cutting a small piece safely on a miter saw or with a miter gauge on a table saw. The crosscut sled I'm building was designed by Jeremy Schmidt, who kindly put together the SketchUp model and published it for free. I'll put a link to his build video about this sled in the description below. My sled has slightly different dimensions and I assemble it slightly differently, but it's otherwise basically the same. The sled is made up of 3/4 inch plywood cut into 3 pieces, a large 24 inch by 18 inch base piece, and 2 walls that are 24 inches by 4.5 inches. The runners can be made out of any hardwood. I like to use oak. In a pinch, you can make the runners out of plywood too. To cut the runners, measure the width of the T-slots on your table saw with calipers, then cut that much off the edge of an oak strip. If you don't have calipers, you can use a tape measure, but it may take a few tries to get the runners to fit nicely. Here, I'm making a bunch of runners all at once, which I'll save for future sleds. A neat trick to make repeated cuts is to use a stop block and move the fence after each cut. The runners should slide easily in the slot with very little wiggle room, and they should be slightly shorter than the full depth of the T-slot. To attach the runners to the sled, use some scraps or some coins to elevate them slightly above the table saw surface, and use spray adhesive to get them initially stuck to the sled bottom. The sled doesn't have to be perfectly square here, but do your best to center it and make it square using the table saw fence. After the runners are stuck on, pre-drill and countersink holes and screw them in place. Take care not to split the runners with the screws, and also make sure to choose screws that won't blow through the other side of the plywood. Next, cut out the front and back walls. The shape is kind of arbitrary, but the central arch should be high enough to leave at least an inch over your saw blade when it's fully raised, and the width of the arch should be wide enough so that if you straddle each side with your hands, your thumbs will stay separated, because the table saw blade is going to be coming through here. On my sled, the arch is 4.5 inches tall and 6 inches wide, and the wings are 1.5 inches tall. Temporarily, attach the 2 walls together with screws so that they can be cut out at the same time, making sure to only screw into off-cut areas. You can use the table saw for some of the cutting out process to get nice straight cuts, and use a bandsaw for the rest. You could also use a jigsaw for this. Put the sled on the table saw and cut out a very small curve. This is just to mark where the blade will be to make sure you don't put any screws there. Keep in mind that the blade might not be centered between the 2 runners, so keep track of which is the front and back of the sled after this. Next, install the back of the sled with screws and glue. This one doesn't have to be perfectly square, it's just there for added structure. Use some offcuts from the walls to make an extra arch. This gets glued on the front of the sled for added structure and safety. Round it over on a router table if you have one, and spray paint it red. I like to spray paint the dangerous parts of jigs red to remind me to be extra careful. Next, round over the rest of the front wall and awkwardly round over the back of the wall that's already attached to the jig because you forgot to do it earlier. All the roundovers are there just to make the sled more comfortable to hold. If you don't have a router, you could skip this step and it would work just fine. Glue the red arch to the front wall, making sure the bottom of the arch is flush with the bottom of the front wall. This will help make sure that the front wall sits square to the bottom of the sled. Use a block plane or some sandpaper to cut a small chamfer on the inside face of the front wall. This provides a small space for sawdust to accumulate without preventing a workpiece from sitting flush against the wall. Next, cut a small notch all the way through the back of the base just to mark where the blade will enter. Connect the right side of the back cutout kerf to the front underside kerf with a straight edge. Here I'm using a framer square just as a straight edge. This marks exactly where the through cut will eventually end up. It's important that the front wall is perpendicular to this line, which might not be perpendicular to the sides of the jig, depending on how well you attach the runners. Use the framer square to draw a line perpendicular to the kerf line to mark where the front wall will be positioned. This is just to roughly position the front wall. It will be more finely adjusted later. Clamp the front wall along the line you just drew and attach it with 2 screws, no glue, close to the center line. This way, the front wall is held in place but can still pivot slightly for adjustments. Attaching it as accurately as possible now will make later steps easier, so use a framer square to align the sides of the front wall and clamp them down before pre-drilling and driving 1 screw into each wing. At this point, the sled will be roughly accurate, but the next step is fine-tuning. To check the accuracy of the sled, perform a 5-cut test on a piece of scrap that is roughly a square. A 5-cut test means you cut off a bit off the side of the scrap square, then rotate the square so the cut faces against the sled wall, and repeat, working your way around the edge of the square. Cut a full strip off on the 5th cut and measure how uniform the thickness of that strip is. The 5th cut exaggerates the sled inaccuracy by a factor of 4, so you can make precise adjustments. If the cutoff isn't straight, remove 1 screw holding that side of the front wall in place, adjust slightly, and drill in a new screw in a slightly offset location. Repeat this until the 5th cut is straight. Make sure you do this once to adjust the left side of the front sled wall, and then again to adjust the right side. Eventually, I got my sled to deviate less than 0.010 of an inch over an 18-inch cut, which is the longest possible on this sled. That's plenty accurate for me. Once you're happy with the adjustments on the front wall, add several more screws to secure it firmly in place. The final step is to apply paste wax to the bottom of the sled, including the runners, to help make it slide smoothly on the saw. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you like watching me make this crosscut sled. If you don't have one of these, I guarantee you it is worth your time to spend an afternoon making one. It will change your life. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below and check out more of my content. Thanks.